There is a clay object in London that holds a secret capable of paralyzing empires. Stay tuned and understand why secular archaeology calls an anomaly what the Bible describes as the deadliest event in history. Don't miss a single second, because today we will reveal the physical proof of how 185,000 elite soldiers simply vanished in a single night, without a single arrow being fired. In this video, we will perform a spiritual autopsy on Sennacherib's Prism to discover what happens when your own siege becomes impossible. Wait to see the exact moment when human logic collapses and the supernatural takes control. If you feel trapped in a cage with no way out for your tomorrow, this documentary was made for you. Prepare to witness the proof that your deliverance doesn't depend on armies, but on the faithfulness of the one who rules the invisible. In the British Museum in London, protected by a pane of bulletproof laminated glass and guarded by state-of-the-art sensors that monitor every particle of humidity and oxygen in the air, rests a hexagonal clay object that at first glance seems insignificant, almost fragile, standing before the colossal winged bull statues, the Lamassu, that once guarded the imperial palaces of Nineveh with their stony gaze. Standing only 15 inches tall, with a dry ochre earth tone that survived the crushing weight of millennia buried beneath the sands of modern-day Iraq, the Sennacherib Prism holds within its faces one of the most deafening, disturbing, and inexplicable silences in the military history of all mankind. Upon it, tight lines of cuneiform script, engraved with almost surgical and rhythmic precision by scribes who trembled before the king's shadow, narrate with a sadistic, detailed, and cold pride the military campaign of the year 701 BC. The Emperor of Assyria, the man who called himself King of the World and King of the Four Quarters, describes in terrifying detail how he reduced 46 fortified cities of the tiny kingdom of Judah to ashes, how he deported 200,150 hostages like nameless cattle, and how he treated his opponents with a visceral cruelty that makes modern barbarism seem, at times, like a superficial act of civility. The clay text spends paragraphs celebrating the exact moment Sennacherib locked King Hezekiah inside Jerusalem, using the famous and humiliating metaphor of a bird trapped in a cage, while around the walls he ordered the construction of massive earth ramps and positioned siege engines whose iron and wood wheels made the sacred ground tremble under a weight that seemed like a moving mountain. But suddenly, the narrative carved with such pomp into the clay is interrupted by an absolute, dry, and inexplicable abyss of silence. There is no glorious record of the final invasion of the capital, no detailed inventory of the gold and silver looted from Solomon's temple, and no macabre description of Hezekiah's head displayed on a wooden stake in the conquered city square. The greatest army the ancient world had ever seen, an elite force composed of veterans hardened in 1,000 battles, simply evaporated from the official Assyrian chronology, leaving behind an enigma that secular science has tried for decades to label a tactical retreat due to a plague, but which the Bible reveals as the deadliest, most silent, and most terrifying night ever recorded on earth, where 185,000 elite men did not just give up on the war, they were disconnected from existence by an invisible power that knows no geographic, political, or military borders. For you to feel the real, physical, and suffocating weight of this event that changed the DNA of Western history, I need you to forget for a few minutes the clean, colorful, and sanitized illustrations from your old school books. I need you to feel in your mind the acrid, ferrous, and metallic scent of fear that impregnated every pore of the sweaty skin of the defenders on the limestone walls of Jerusalem. Sennacherib's Assyria was not just a frenetically expanding geographic empire, it was a psychological terror machine designed to decompose the souls of nations long before the first bronze arrow was fired on the battlefield. Their method was systematic and visual dehumanization. Prisoners of war were flayed alive, and their skins, still damp, were stretched before the gates of besieged cities so that the agonizing screams and the sight of the horror would break the will to fight of those watching from atop the walls. Hezekiah was not facing just a passing geopolitical crisis or a humiliating administrative defeat that would result in higher taxes. He was looking directly into the cold, soulless eyes of the total extermination of his lineage, the cultural annihilation of his people, and the very destruction of the eternal promise that sustained his faith in sunny days. The pressure the Judean king felt was not a poetic abstraction written for future generations. It was a violent, biological response, an unbearable, icy and physical knot in the pit of his stomach, the metallic, rhythmic and incessant sound of thousands of leather boots marching around his consciousness, whispering through the cracks of the palace door that tomorrow was a physical impossibility. Perhaps you recognize this weight today, not because of an Assyrian iron army camped in your backyard, but because there is a Sennacherib letter on your desk right now. Whether it is the cold, white, impersonal paper of a terminal medical diagnosis, the suffocating weight of a debt growing like an avalanche, or the silent, painful collapse of a decades-long relationship that has besieged your life and drained every drop of your hope for healing. You feel exactly like Hezekiah, trapped in the cage, watching the ramps of destruction being slowly built around you by circumstances. And the question this millennial archaeological silence forces us to answer with honesty is, what remains to be done when human logic, science and mathematics say the fall is inevitable, but the Creator claims in a low whisper that the battle was never yours? The roar that echoed outside the rustic and ancient limestone walls of Jerusalem was composed not only of the clatter of bronze swords and the creaking of chariots, but of the weight of a calculated blasphemy that sought to crush the human spirit before even touching the physical stone of the fortifications. Sennacherib, in his strategic arrogance and knowledge of the human psyche, did not just send hardened infantry generals to negotiate. He sent the Rabshakeh, a master in the manipulation of pain, doubt and dread, someone specifically trained to destroy internal resistance through the distilled and refined poison of words. He did not address the people from atop a horse in a foreign, guttural and distant language, which would have created a wall of misunderstanding. He spoke fluent Aramaic, the language of the streets of Jerusalem, the same language mothers used to sing lullabies to their children in the silence of besieged homes, ensuring the panic penetrated unfiltered into every ear and made the blood of the sentinels run cold in the dead of night. His words were invisible, sharp blades. He claimed with public mockery that the God of Israel was just another minor, local and powerless deity, a superstition about to be buried by the dust of the Assyrian legions, exactly as had happened to the gods of neighboring nations, from Hamath to Arpad, which were now only ashes and bitter memories of defeat. Imagine now the suffocating, almost solid silence that fell upon the guards on the walls, the cold sweat mixed with torch soot running down thin faces marked by extreme hunger and thirst, while human logic, cold, purely mathematical and realistic, whispered that any attempt at resistance was just a slower, stupider, and more painful method of collective suicide. Assyria possessed the steel, the superior military technology of the age, inexhaustible logistics, and the overwhelming volume of bodies trained from childhood to kill. Jerusalem possessed only the heavy silence of a sky that, to the eyes of wounded flesh and exhaustion, seemed to have abandoned its children to their own cruel and random fate. Hezekiah, the man history immortalized as the monarch who had the Herculean courage to purify an entire nation through a deep spiritual reform, was at that moment reduced to his most basic, naked, and terribly vulnerable humanity. His royal robes, woven from the finest white linen of Egypt and adorned with gold threads that once shone with splendor under the sun of Judah, were now nothing more than useless and heavy reminders of a human power that could not save him from the sharp scythe of Assyrian death. With a gesture of total surrender and sacred despair, he tore that symbol of earthly authority before his servants and covered his skin with sackcloth, a fabric made of goat hair so scratchy, pungent and coarse that every movement was a physical puncture, a constant irritation that served as a sensory reminder of the fragility of life and the imminence of the grave. He did not seek shelter in endless strategic meetings with his generals to count remaining arrows or discuss the technical inclination of the Assyrian ramps, for the mathematics of survival had already delivered a final verdict of absolute bloody and humiliating defeat. Instead, he walked alone, his feet feeling the cold of the stones, to the temple, crossing the cold stone courtyards with hands visibly trembling with terror, holding Sennacherib's letters as if they were burning coals that scorched his fingers and consumed his soul. Hezekiah spread those documents of pure terror upon the rustic altar in the Holy of Holies of the temple, not as one presenting a bureaucratic dossier for divine approval, but as one exposing a gangrenous, foul wound that cries out for a healing that the human hand could never perform in the chronological time he had left. While the Judean king prostrated himself in the dense, almost palpable silence of the temple, the Assyrian camp outside the walls was a living, pulsing, monstrous organism of metal, fury, and sweat, a sea of tired, loud faces filled with a self-confidence that seemed to crack the very structure of the earth under the hooves of thousands of war horses. There, 185,000 elite men, the deadliest force the ancient world had ever seen march in formation, gave themselves over to sadistic and arrogant confidence, celebrating in advance the banquet of blood and loot the dawn promised to deliver as a reward for months of marching. The smell of lamb roasting on hundreds of campfires mixed with the stench of sweat accumulated in scale armor, tanned leather, and war machine oil, while Sennacherib's soldiers slept the deep and heavy sleep of the victors, protected by sentinels who watched a sky that seemed to them empty of any threat that wasn't human. But as the night moved past midnight, the atmosphere in the valley of Hinnom began to change in density, becoming heavy, icy, and strangely electric in a way that no campfire, no matter how high, could dissipate from the skin of those still awake. There was no deafening roar of celestial chariots crossing the firmament or blinding glare of radiant angels, as classical Renaissance paintings often depict for our aesthetic comfort. The divine intervention moved with the terrifying and silent subtlety of a tide shifting in the darkness, an invisible rupture in biological normality that left no physical footprints on the ground, but removed with eternal precision the breath of life from thousands of lungs simultaneously. Imagine now the Assyrian sentry at his forward post, a warrior hardened by decades of brutal conquests, relentless sieges and looting, suddenly feeling a sudden and inexplicable biological tremor run through his calloused hand as it held the cold bronze spear. This tremor was not the accumulated exhaustion of the siege or the cold of the early morning, but the subconscious perception of the presence of an invisible execution force that crossed the linen tents with the speed and absolute silence of a final breath, disconnecting the life of each man as if extinguishing a candle flame at the light and decisive touch of the wind. 185,000 hearts, which beat in sync with the rhythm of destruction, pride and imperial power, ceased in an absolute unison of mortal silence. The angel of the Lord did not need physical swords made by human hands or an earthly army to perform the greatest spiritual autopsy in recorded history. He simply removed the vital breath from that proud human mass, leaving behind an army that became, in seconds, an infinite collection of cold flesh statues, eyes open to nothingness and hands still clutching useless swords. When the bursting desert sun began to illuminate the valley the next morning, Sennacherib did not wake to the metallic sound of shields being polished or to the orders of his generals, but to a silence so dense and heavy it seemed to steal the oxygen from his own imperial lungs, revealing that the man who boasted of being the absolute owner of the world was but a frightened and naked prisoner of his own insignificance before the eternal God. Sennacherib's awakening on that fateful morning was not announced by the harsh and familiar sound of bronze horns or by the authoritative and confident command of his trusted generals, but by a weight of death that seemed to have stolen the density of the air across the entire valley of Judah. Imagine the emperor stepping out of his luxurious tent, his feet touching the icy sand of dawn, expecting to find a vibrant army ready for the final massacre of Jerusalem, but instead encountering a human desert of motionless men under the pale, cold, and indifferent light of morning. There were no signs of physical struggle in the tents, no interrupted battle cries, no wounds from swords or arrows in combat. Only the absolute, overwhelming and supernatural silence of 185,000 soldiers, who seemed to have merged into the desert landscape like statues of bronze and grey flesh. The dread Sennacherib felt was not just the rational fear of a humiliating military defeat that would ruin his reputation, but the biological shock of facing a force that could not be wounded, bribed, or negotiated with, a force that operated in a dimension where all his cutting-edge war technology was obsolete, childish, and useless. The man who boasted of being the owner of the ancient world was now trapped in his own abysmal impotence, surrounded by the sweetish stench of an army cooling rapidly under the rising sun, feeling in his own body the knot of dread in his stomach that he himself had provoked in so many other nations through the systematic use of terror. It is here that modern archaeology and Sennacherib's Prism reveal the ultimate spiritual autopsy of this event that changed the course of religions and the Western world. When you look closely, with microscopic attention, at the cuneiform inscriptions on that clay hexagon in the British Museum, you notice what historians and epigraphers call a strategic omission laden with millennial shame. Sennacherib describes in sadistic detail and gritty textures the 46 cities he destroyed and the gold he tore from Judah for his coffers, but he remains deafeningly and suspiciously silent about the final outcome of the siege of Jerusalem. He cannot admit before his subjects, his gods, and posterity that his elite army was disconnected by an invisible, sovereign, and incomprehensible touch. So he simply ends the narrative abruptly and hastily, claiming that Hezekiah sent him heavy tributes and that he decided by an act of supposed benevolence or his own will to return to Nineveh. From me to you, understand now that the shame hidden in the gaps of that worn clay is the most powerful, physical, and irrefutable proof of God's silent victory over human noise and propaganda. Sennacherib fled back to his capital not as a victorious conqueror who annexed a new province, but as a man who saw the Creator's finger write the end of his arrogance in the bloody and silent sands of Judah. Sennacherib's return to Nineveh had no trumpets of glory or parades of shackled prisoners, but the dry, solitary, and terrifying echo of footsteps in cold stone corridors that now seemed empty of any real meaning, divinity, or protection. The man who saw himself as an invincible demigod, whose words changed the fate of rivers and mountains, now walked among the stone reliefs of his palace, feeling a cold in his bones that no purple silk robe or fine leopard skin could ever warm again. He tried desperately to fill the vacuum left by 185,000 men with the noise of monumental new buildings and bas reliefs that glorified his own ego, But the image of that silent and freezing morning in Judah was an indelible bloodstain on his memory that nothing, not wine, not power, could erase or justify to himself. The Bible records with a historical rawness, devoid of adornment, that the end of the one who affronted the Lord did not come on a glorious battlefield, defending his empire, but within his own place of religious refuge, in the temple of Nisroch, betrayed by his own blood at the hands of his own sons, Adramelech and Sharezer. It is the anatomy of a complete and tragic spiritual collapse. When you build your exclusive security on terror, raw matter, and proud self-sufficiency, the very beams you raised with the sweat of others and with pride end up crushing your own soul in the silence of the night, far from any army. From me to you, I invite you now to look at this story not as a distant, dusty, and irrelevant archaeological event for the 21st century, but as a direct, clear and uncomfortable mirror of your own life and your monumental challenges today. How many times do we also build impenetrable emotional sieges around ourselves, relying only on the limited strength of our own arm and letting ourselves be paralyzed by the threat letters that fear writes in bold letters in our minds every night before sleep comes? Sennacherib's insatiable, anxious, and violent search for control and security is the same as that of every man or woman who desperately tries to fill an infinite hole in their chest with finite, ephemeral, and material conquests. We are the direct heirs of that same hunger for control that without God always ends in silence, frustration, bitterness, and dust. The Assyrian emperor had the clay prism to try to save his reputation before men, but Hezekiah had the eternal rock that needs no propaganda to stay standing. One remained recorded as an archaeological curiosity of an empire dead and buried for millennia. The other lives to this day in the memory of faith as an eternal testimony that prayer made with one's face on the cold ground, in the midst of the most terrible siege, is the most powerful survival technology that exists in the created universe. Perhaps you feel now as you listen to me that the siege engines of fear are making the ground of your own life tremble, and that the constant sound of negative thoughts and accusing voices says there is no way out, no cure, and no tomorrow for you or your family. But the spiritual application of this ancient and real story is a practical and urgent healing tool for your now. The same God who ruled the air, the breath, and the atoms over the Assyrian camp is the one who rules, with absolute precision, the invisible and complex details of your financial, emotional, or health crisis today. Real security, the kind that generates peace in the middle of chaos, is not in the temporary absence of armies or problems around you, for they will always come, but in the constant and vigilant presence of a captain who is not impressed by threats carved in clay, nor by the shouts of modern-day Rabshakehs, nor by unfavorable human statistics. Do not let the cold and blind logic of the impossible silence your song of faith in the middle of the dark night. Understand that sometimes the prolonged and agonizing silence of God is only the sacred and necessary space He is creating, so that your next victory has no reasonable human or technical explanation, but only a divine, supernatural, and sovereign explanation. The throne of the universe is not vacant. It remains occupied by the one who laughs at the pretensions of human empires, and the same God who led humanity through the terrifying sieges of 701 BC, preserving the lineage from which the Savior would be born, is leading you personally now through your particular storm. Rest your heart in the silence of trust, for deliverance does not come from the number of your soldiers, but from the faithfulness of the one who promised never to forsake you. Sennacherib's prism is but cold clay in a museum. The word of God is spirit and life, and it says that you will prevail. If this journey through the sands of time and the secrets of archaeology has touched your soul and brought a new perspective to the invisible battles you face today, I ask you for something simple yet powerful. Click the like button. This small gesture signals that Hezekiah's message of hope is still relevant in 2026. Subscribe now to the channel The Bible Teaches and turn on the notification bell. Do not let the noise of the world drown out the next revelation we are preparing for you. Here, we don't just tell ancient stories, we unearth truths that heal the present. And now for the most important part, I want to hear your voice. Sennacherib's prism was a record of pride, but our comment section will be a record of faith. What is the siege you are facing today? What is the situation that seems to have locked you in a cage? Right below, I surrender my siege to the Lord. Our community is ready to join you in prayer because, just as in Jerusalem, deliverance begins when our cry touches heaven. Stay with the peace that surpasses all understanding, keep your eyes on the rock, and we'll see you in the next video.